The fog clung to the dark pines like a burial shroud. In the pre-dawn darkness of November 2nd, 1944, Private James Lindsay of the 28th Infantry Division crouched in a foxhole barely deep enough to shelter a man, his hands trembling not from fear, but from the bone-deep cold that had settled into the Hürtgen Forest. Around him, the trees stood like cathedral columns, towering firs and pines so dense that even in daylight, the forest floor remained in perpetual twilight. Lindsay had survived Normandy. He'd seen friends cut down on Omaha Beach, had watched the hedgerows of France claim men by the dozen, but nothing had prepared him for this place, this green hell, where death came not in dramatic charges across open beaches, but in slow, grinding horror beneath an endless canopy of trees. The Hürtgen Forest, a 50-square-mile tract of dense woodland along the German-Belgian border, would consume American forces for 3 before it was over. It would claim more American lives in a single day than any other battle in the war, including D-Day. Yet today, most Americans have never heard of it. The trap. The strategic reasoning seemed sound enough in the autumn of 1944. Allied forces, flush with the triumph of the Normandy invasion and the liberation of Paris, were racing toward Germany. The Hürtgen Forest sat astride their path to the Rhine River and the vital Rohr River dams. American commanders believed that clearing the forest would protect the right flank of the First Army's advance and prevent the Germans from using the high ground to observe and strike Allied positions. What they didn't fully appreciate was that the Germans had turned the Hürtgen into a fortress. For months, German engineers had transformed the forest into a killing ground of diabolical ingenuity. They had pre-sighted every trail, every clearing, every likely avenue of approach. They had laid thousands of mines, anti-personnel, bouncing betties that leaped waist-high before exploding, wooden shoe mines that couldn't be detected by metal detectors, and anti-tank teller mines that turned the few logging roads into death traps. The German defenders weren't the demoralized, retreating rabble that Allied intelligence had predicted. Many were hardened veterans, fighting for their homeland. They occupied concrete bunkers, pillboxes, and log-reinforced positions that were nearly invisible in the dense undergrowth. They knew every meter of terrain, every fold in the ground, every sight line through the trees, into the Cathedral of Death. The 9th Infantry Division entered the forest first in mid-September, expecting to clear it in days. They learned the truth quickly. In the Hürtgen, all the advantages of American military might, air superiority, armor, artillery, were negated by the terrain. Tanks couldn't maneuver off the narrow fire breaks. Aircraft couldn't see targets through the canopy. Artillery shells exploded in the treetops, creating deadly airbursts of shrapnel and wooden splinters that shredded men below. Communication broke down almost immediately. Radio signals couldn't penetrate the dense forest. Units became separated in the gloom. Men fought in squad-sized groups, often unable to see more than 50 yards in any direction. The usual rules of warfare dissolved into something more primitive, a struggle for survival in a green maze where the enemy was everywhere and nowhere. Sergeant Robert Thompson of the 4th Infantry Division would later recall, "You couldn't see the Germans. You couldn't see your own men half the time. You just heard the snap of bullets cutting through branches, the scream of artillery, and then someone near you would start screaming." The trees themselves became weapons. When shells hit the canopy, it rained wood and steel. Men died from splinters the size of daggers. The weather turned against them too. November brought cold rain that turned the forest floor into sucking mud. Foxholes filled with water. Men developed trench foot by the thousands, a medieval affliction that rotted flesh and could lead to amputation. The wounded often couldn't be evacuated for hours or even days. Medics struggled to find casualties in the undergrowth, following the sound of moans and screams through the darkness. The killing ground. By early November, 3 American divisions had been fed into the forest. The 9th, badly mauled, was pulled out. The 28th Infantry Division, the Pennsylvania National Guard unit that had proudly marched through Paris in August, entered the meat grinder. What followed was systematic destruction. The Germans had turned the tiny villages in and around the forest, places called Wassenach, Schmidt, Kammerscheid. The 28th Division attacked toward Schmidt along a ridgeline that became known as the Call Trail, a narrow track that descended into a ravine and then climbed back up to the objective. The division took Schmidt on November 3rd, but the position was exposed on 3 sides. The Germans counterattacked with tanks and fresh infantry. American forces, unable to bring up their own armor effectively, were overrun. The retreat down the Call Trail became a rout. Men fled through the forest, pursued by German fire, leaving behind weapons, equipment, and wounded comrades. In 5 days of fighting, the 28th Infantry Division effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Of the approximately 6,000 men who had entered the forest, more than 6,000 became casualties, killed, wounded, captured, or psychologically broken. The division had been destroyed, achieving nothing of strategic value. The butcher's bill. The Americans kept feeding divisions into the Hurtgen, the 4th Infantry Division, the 8th Infantry Division, elements of the 1st Infantry Division, the famed Big Red One. All took their turn in the green hell. Each suffered catastrophic casualties. Companies that had entered the forest at full strength of 200 men emerged with 30 or 40. Some rifle companies were commanded by sergeants because all their officers were dead or wounded. The psychological toll matched the physical carnage. Combat exhaustion, what would later be called PTSD, reached epidemic levels. Men simply broke under the strain of fighting an invisible enemy in claustrophobic darkness, of watching friends die from unseen mines and artillery, of existing in constant cold and wet with no end in sight. Entire units had to be pulled from the line, not because they lacked men, but because those men could no longer function. Private First Class Eddie Slovic of the 28th Division, terrified by what he'd witnessed in the forest, deserted his unit. He was court-martialed and, in January 1945, became the first American soldier executed for desertion since the Civil War. His case remains controversial, but it underscored the desperation that the Hurtgen engendered. By the time American forces finally cleared the forest in February 1945, not through breakthrough, but through slow yard-by-yard attrition, the butcher's bill was staggering. Conservative estimates put American casualties at 33,000, with some historians arguing the true number approached 55,000 when non-combat casualties from trench foot, frostbite, and combat exhaustion are included. On November 16, 1944, during the height of the fighting, American forces suffered approximately 750 killed in action in the Hürtgen Forest alone, making it why we forgot the Hürtgen Forest faded from American memory for several reasons, all of them uncomfortable. First, it was a battle with no clear strategic justification. Unlike D-Day, which opened the Second Front and began the liberation of Europe, the Hürtgen campaign achieved little of military value. The Roer River dams, ostensibly the objective, were never taken during the forest fighting. When the Germans opened the dams during the later Battle of the Bulge, they flooded the Roer Valley anyway, demonstrating that the entire campaign might have been unnecessary. General James Gavin, commander of the 82nd Airborne Division, later called the Hürtgen battle a monument to the inflexibility of military planners. Ernest Hemingway, who observed the fighting as a war correspondent, described it as Passchendaele with tree bursts, a reference to one of World War I's most notorious slaughters. Second, the battle came at an awkward time in the war's narrative. By November 1944, the American public believed victory was imminent. Paris had been liberated. Allied armies were approaching Germany's borders, and optimistic headlines spoke of being home by Christmas. The grinding horror of the Hurtgen didn't fit this narrative of inevitable triumph. Third, and perhaps most significantly, the battle was followed immediately by the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, which captured public attention and historical focus. The German counteroffensive through the Ardennes, with its dramatic breakthrough and the surrounded garrison at Bastogne, made for a more compelling story, one with clear heroes, dramatic reversals, and ultimate victory. The Hürtgen Forest, by contrast, was a slow-motion catastrophe with no heroes, no decisive moments, and no clear victory. It was a battle that Americans had little reason to remember and every reason to forget. The men who remained in a small cemetery near the German village of Hurtgen. White crosses stand in neat rows among the trees. Some mark the graves of American soldiers who fell in the forest and were never recovered. Others are memorials to men whose remains were eventually brought home, but whose souls, survivors said, never really left those dark woods. James Lindsay survived the Hürtgen Forest. He returned to Ohio after the war, married, raised 3 children, and worked for 30 years at a tool and die factory. He almost never spoke about the war. His daughter would later recall that he couldn't bear to go camping, couldn't tolerate being in forests. He kept the lights on at night until the day he died. When asked once, late in life, about his war service, Lindsay said only, "People remember the beaches. They remember the jump into France. They don't remember the forest, but the forest remembered us. It took the best men I ever knew, and nobody even knows their names." The Hürtgen Forest today is peaceful, a nature preserve popular with hikers, but beneath the fallen leaves and moss, fragments of war remain. Rusted helmets, shell casings, the occasional unexploded mine. Local authorities still cordon off areas too dangerous for the public, and sometimes, after heavy rains expose the forest floor, hikers find bones. The trees that witnessed the battle are mostly gone now, cut down for timber in the decades after the war. But the forest has regrown, as forests do. The green cathedral stands again, beautiful and serene, keeping its secrets. In 1944, for 3 months, it was the deadliest place on Earth, and almost nobody remembers. Epilogue, a reckoning. Military historians continue to debate whether the Hürtgen Forest battle was necessary. Some argue that bypassing the forest and advancing around it would have been wiser, except others contend that commanders didn't fully understand the terrain and defensive preparations they faced until it was too late to change course without appearing to retreat. What's certain is that the battle represented a failure of adaptation. The same American military that had learned to overcome the hedgerows of Normandy, that had developed combined arms tactics, and shown remarkable flexibility in other campaigns, somehow kept repeating the same mistakes in the Hürtgen. Divisions were fed into the forest piecemeal, each expected to succeed where predecessors had failed, using essentially the same tactics against prepared defenses. The soldiers paid for these mistakes with their lives and their sanity. They fought with extraordinary courage in impossible conditions, not for any grand strategic objective, but because they were ordered to do so and because their brothers in arms depended on them. On Veterans Day, we remember D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, Iwo Jima, and other iconic battles. We should also remember the Hürtgen Forest, not despite, but because of its horror, its futility, and the sacrifice of thousands of young men who died in a green hell that history chose to forget. They deserve to be remembered. The forest certainly hasn't forgotten them.